I'm inviting you all to listen in. Find your headphones if you need to find your headphones. Maybe you could share it just a bit more, let people know that we're about to start, and let's full. So yes, as I said, good afternoon, and welcome to another installment of the Guyana Marine Conservation Society webinar series. And today we will be talking about gender and the marine environment. To begin, my name is Kyle Joseph, and I will be your moderator for today. I am from Region 9, and so as you know, not everywhere in Guyana has the best internet right now. So in the event that I do have internet issues, someone from the Guyana Marine Conservation Society will step in place, and her name is Stella Madette. And so just to put that out there. So to begin with, we have an amazing set of people for today. People with full of experience in their own field, and they will be taking us through and talking us through the relationship between gender and the marine environment. And so the first person we will hear from today will be Hanan Lachman Singh, and she will be talking about a gender responsive approach to marine projects. She's an environmental biologist, and she's very passionate about sustainability's intersectionality, biomimicry, tropical field work, and of course, Guyanese development. She holds a Bachelor of Science degree in Environmental Science and Anthropology, which she got from the University of the West Indies. And she works to raise awareness of the adverse impacts of gender and ethnic inequality on conservation and sustainable development. Our second presenter our panelist, is Joel Thompson, and he will be talking about the role of gender in riverine resource management and protection in Guyanese communities. Joel is a Jesuit and an activist, and he's interested in the relationship between technology, culture, religion, and environment. He holds a Bachelor of Science degree in Electrical Engineering, a Bachelor of Arts in Philosophy and Religion. He also has a Master of Science in Environment and Development from the London School of Economics and Political Science. And his dissertation was one that focused on Indigenous conceptions of well-being and environment. And most of his work has, it has focused on the environment and social justice. The final panelist you'll be hearing from today is Felicia Collins, and she'll be talking about gender equality and representation of women in marine conservation. She hails from Port Kaituma. She's a nature enthusiast, and she's passionate about conservation biology and indigenous development. And it's her life goal to help protect and conserve Guyana's biodiversity. She recently graduated from the University of the West Indies with first-class honors, where she received a Bachelor of Science degree in biology, specializing in marine biology, ecology, and environmental biology. So now that we know who our panelists are, I invite everyone to sit forward. I want no one to be sitting back today. I want you to sit forward, listen keenly to what each panelist has to say. Each of them will be doing a presentation for about 10 minutes each. After those 10 minutes, we are going to have a Q&A segment for about 20 minutes. So as you listen and understand what the persons are saying, I hope that you all have very engaging questions afterwards that we can try to answer, do our best to answer. And after the Q&A of 20 minutes, we'll finally close it off. And so let's be sure as we listen to the panelists that we turn off our microphones, turn off our cameras, and give the space to the panelists. So again, welcome everyone. I really hope you enjoy what we have in store for you today. And without much more talking from me, I'm going to now invite Ms. Hanan Lachman Singh, who is our first panelist. So over to Ms. Lachman Singh.
Right. Let's share. Ooh. Can you guys see my screen? Yeah?
Yes, we can.
Good day, everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening. I can't tell you how much it means to me to finally have this conversation. As Kyle mentioned, my name is Hanan, And I believe that understanding the relationship between gender and the environment is key to addressing environmental challenges in an equitable and sustainable way. My presentation today, Fishing for Change, will look at the elements of a gender responsive approach and how it can be applied to marine projects. But before we go into that, I'm not entirely sure if you all have heard as yet that there's been some breaking news. A country has been found that's achieved gender equality. Yeah, I know. It's called Equiterra. It's where, regardless of gender, all people have equal rights and opportunities. Women and girls feel safe walking at night. They get paid equally as men for work of the same value. Isn't that amazing? Girls are as valued as boys are, and people of all gender and sexuality feel safe and equal. This is what gender equality looks like. And I'd like us to go on a quick tour of its busy capital. So let's start on Unstereotype Avenue and make a little left onto Violence Free Alley, which leads us on to Equal Pay Street, where people laugh and tell stories like, hey, remember the gender pay gap? Now, after a quick stroll around Inclusion Square, we find ourselves on Climate Action Street. In Equiterra, there are no deniers of climate change. Everyone does their part to protect the earth and takes action to stop rising temperatures and the destruction of resources. There is sustainable and safe public transport that reduces the need for everyone to own and use cars. Sustainable recycled fashion is the rage here, which limits waste. And you see women leading the charge in equal footing with men, women leaders in business and government having key actors in making the policies that are protecting the environment. With the inclusion of women's experiences, talents, and perspectives, Equiterra has found new ways of sustainably reducing the country's carbon footprint and food waste. But now it's time for a reality check. And this may come as a shock to you, but Equiterra is not real. To date, no country in the world has achieved gender equality. Additionally, 80% of people who are displaced by climate change are women, and only 10% of total aid for agriculture, forestry, and fishing goes to women. Now, before we go further into our topic, I just like to acknowledge our audience, who typically, when drawn to conversations that are held by our group, are often fluent in the language of environmental conservation than in the finer nuances of gender and feminist theory. So I'm just going to take a minute to define gender. Gender is a social construct. It regulates what activities and behaviors are appropriate for men and women, in addition to regulating the relationships between and among men and women. Now, something happens when people hear the word gender. It reminds them that whatever privilege they have is fragile and impermanent. Frankly, I understand that can feel a bit threatening for all of the values and patterns of behaviors that you take for granted to be challenged. It tends to create feelings of guilt, which, to quote Tarrant, is a paralyzing, unproductive emotion. Now, don't get me wrong, guilt is a normal response to having your whole identity and self-worth be questioned. But from positions of guilt and insecurity, people don't change, and they don't inspire others to change. And I think that everyone present here is well versed in championing for change, climate change in particular. So I invite you all to hold a responsibility in trying to change your own sexist behaviors and attitudes. Now, a question that may be difficult to conceptualize at times is how are gender and the marine environment connected? To make this a little more tangible, here are some key aspects in their relationship. Their livelihoods. The environment is affected by cultural, socioeconomic structures and processes which determine how women and men access and use natural resources. Their gender norms. Gender relations influence how households and communities are organized. It also affects how decisions are made and resources are managed. There are gender roles. The interaction between men and women and the environment is differentiated by their roles, needs, responsibilities, and power relations. Now, environmental changes and gender inequalities affect sustainable management of natural resources. These inequalities tend to increase with environmental degradation and climate change. Lastly, environmental interventions are not gender neutral. Environmental policies and projects impact men and women differently. So now that we can recognize the very real links between gender and the environment, we have to find ways of mainstreaming gender into projects. What has been done in many IUCN and FAO projects is use of a gender responsive approach. Mainstreaming gender is not a linear process. There is no one size fits all solution because men and women use natural resources differently, but it has been done across South America. For instance, in Peru's Life Out of Plastic, a woman led project, they've upcycled about 1.3 million PET bottles that would have otherwise ended up in a landfill or in the ocean. In Colombia, they've created women's knowledge networks, which have led to cleaner production processes in construction by using photovoltaic energy for lighting and pumping water. But what does this look like in a local context? Can Guyana even adopt gender responsive approaches in our projects? A success story that's often given is the Mangrove Restoration Project in Guyana, and I'd like us to walk through that together this afternoon. Mangroves are found along most of Guyana's coastline. They play an important role in coastal protection and conservation of biological diversity. Their services are valuable for human health and are linked intimately to those whose livelihoods depend on firewood, shellfish, medicine, and just living on a coastline that's below sea level. So the first thing that we're going to look at is we need gender responsive stakeholder consultations. We need to identify the women and the men who are likely to be affected by a mangrove restoration project. Right away, we know that those are going to be the fishermen who benefit from the spawning grounds from the availability of fish, and also the women who catch crabs or use the forest for medicinal purposes. Having meaningful consultation recognizes that there are obstacles for some people, oftentimes women, to speak freely and share their opinions or concerns. Sometimes setting a time and a date for a community meeting just isn't enough. When men dominate a crowd, you have to wonder, why aren't there women present? Or even if they are present, men tend to overpower their voices. By meeting with men and women in separate groups or arranging for different times to meet with women may seem like an extra step, but this is what gender responsive consultations aim to achieve, to overcome these barriers and create the conditions for inclusive and balanced dialogue. All right, our second step will be gender analysis. To conduct a gender analysis at the inception of the Mangrove Restoration Project includes the women and the men who are in coastal communities, which are oftentimes closely connected to their coastal ecosystems. Their gender roles are often traditionally identified and clearly divided. Men are strong and brave, so they're going to be the ones to go out in big boats and do the dangerous fishing, and women will wait ever so patiently by collecting firewood until the men return for them to collect and then clean the fish. In these areas, there is still more focus on women. Gender is synonymous for women rather than an examination of the masculine and the feminine, and how the intersectionality of identities tends to influence decisions and shape opportunities in life and relationships with the environment. Our third step will be gender responsive actions. Our approach needs to ensure that women's and men's voices are considered equally and aim to improve women's social and economic empowerment. So, for example, by training women on various subjects such as project management, tour guiding, beekeeping, and other strategies for strengthening organization, they'll be better equipped to explore economic opportunities, such as honey production in the forest, tourism activities like mangrove tours, and mangrove cultivation. Combining economic opportunity with environmental restoration results not only in the natural protection to our coastal communities, but building holistic resilience in coastal Guyana by empowering women as project participants and environmental leaders. Our last element is gender responsive monitoring and evaluation. Identifying and using gender sensitive indicators and targets to assess whether or not stakeholders were able to participate equally in the design, implementation, and monitoring of the mangrove restoration project. Use of gender analysis frameworks to better conceptualize the process of empowerment through a series of measurable actions. So we can look at what extent was gender equality and women's empowerment advanced as a result of the mangrove restoration, So things like what percentage of women make up participants in mangrove cultivation and management, as well as what alternative sources of income do community members have now as compared to before. Feedback loops might just be the most important strategy because honestly, we're rarely going to get it right on the first go. Working with people, there is an ever-changing dynamic, but it's our responsibility to feed our results into a project design, to make modification when things don't align. Planners need to be open to making changes as the process evolves over time, so that we're continuously adapting better and better approaches capable of learning from experience and creating feedback loops at every stage. In closing, integrating a gender responsive approach in conservation efforts recognizes women not just as passive project beneficiaries, but as active drivers of change toward conservation and sustainable development. Many environmentally consequential decisions are made within households and are filtered through gender norms and rules. Women are not only victims, but also powerful actors of change. Time and time again, it is seen that women's equitable participation and representation in environmental decision-making leads to better social and environmental well-being, despite the existing structural and sociocultural barriers. But don't be fooled, women's empowerment doesn't occur in a vacuum, and incorporating men is important in the process of change. Now, with that being said, I'm hoping that after today, we can begin to make space in our community for more conversations that highlight intersectional environmentalism. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Hanan Lachman Singh. And that was her with a gender responsive approach to marine projects. And now I saw a lot of persons would have joined the chat. So I want to welcome again and say a very good afternoon to everyone joining us. This is yet another installment of the Guyana Marine Conservation Society webinar series. And so our next, as we move on, we'll go on to our next panelist, who is Mr. Joel Thompson. And he will be taking us through the role of gender in riverine resource management. So over to you, Joel.
Thank you very much, Kyle. So yeah, today I'm going to focus on riverine communities and especially gender and management and protection of rivers. So riverine communities, so these are the communities that live on or near river banks in Guyana, or they're very dependent, heavily dependent on rivers for food or for cultural activities. And Guyana, as many of us know, is the land of many waters. From top to bottom, we have rivers. So I'm going to focus today on the south and central Rupununi because these are areas I'm familiar with. So many rivers in Guyana, but I can only focus on communities in a small part. So if you're from the Northwest or you're from Essequibo, I'm sorry if I don't mention your rivers, but you're in my mind. So you see the shaded area on the right. Are we speaking about communities, as I mentioned, in the north and central Rupununi? And the map on the left just shows how really, I think rivers really define Guyana. I think many people are struck by that from around the world when they come and they hear the land of many waters and they see how major rivers running across Guyana. So that's very important to note. I'm going to speak now about the beauty of our rivers. It's easy to look at our rivers as resources. I don't always like to think of rivers as resources, only because that's like an instrumental view. But it's nice to take the intrinsic value approach that rivers are beautiful in themselves. But often we can't help but viewing them instrumentally. And if we think about them, the first thing that came to my mind was fresh water. I think we're down to about 1% in the world of all the water on the planet is of fresh water. And this resource is dwindling, as we speak here. And in the Guyana Shield provides about, say, 15% of the world's fresh water. Right? And our main river and resources are fishing, agriculture. But we have beautiful animals like otters and turtles, etc. So Guyana is really blessed with all of this beauty. Sometimes this beauty is spoiled by activities, industrial activities that are not regulated or monitored. So bauxite mining is one of these. If you've ever been up the Linden Highway and you see all these blue lakes, it's caused by industrial runoff. Um, but not only bauxite mining, gold mining is also responsible for spoiling much of our beauty of our rivers in Guyana. But I do admit that the mining industry provides, a lot of income for many Guyanese and for the country as a whole. But it does spoil a bit of our beauty, right? Because this is what a typical mine site looks like. Um, so rivers are polluted and um, well, mining waste and also mercury gets into much of the groundwater and the surface water of our rivers. So it's like a double-edged sword, or as one of my friends told me, well, you have to crack an egg to make an omelette. He was speaking about the environment. I said, okay. But some people argue, well, we need income, so we need to do this. But I leave the answers up to you, what you think about that. Um, and there's so much we do near rivers and so much that we destroy the beauty through deforestation, through hunting, etc. I'll just focus today on one activity. So gold mining, the use of mercury, we know it's bad for human health. It's particularly dangerous for expectant mothers. It's very harmful to our well-being, our health. So from our liver to kidney, our nerves. And for those communities, especially those in the South Rupununi, that their main source of protein is from rivers. They're heavily dependent on fishing. So they have no other sources of protein. So when miners near the Cuyuni River and they use mercury, a study that was done in 2017 that was published this year, they found that people that live in these communities, for example, Parabaram, or if you live in Aishalton, Crowdar, they have high levels of mercury in their bodies because the fish, of course, migrate downstream. They get into other rivers, Rupununi River, etc. And so it's very harmful to people who live in these areas. So a simple thing like mercury mining. And it's not only in the South Rupununi, but I'm just showing briefly here some rivers throughout Guyana have high levels of mercury. So that's something to think about as we think of river and resources. We think of the harm, and we think about who's being affected. Communities dependent on these rivers for their protein needs. How does gender factor into all of this? That's a question that probably brought you here. It's a question that I have. But I think a true understanding of ecology is that everything is connected. We can't do activities in isolation or take the silo approach to industry. And human beings are not at the top of creation. We are part of creation. So everything we do, it's part of, I think Hanan mentioned, a feedback loop. It's whatever we do in one part, it affects another part, either positively or negatively. So it's either positive or negative feedback loop. When it comes to managing these resources, such as our fresh water, our fishes, etc., what role does gender play? And the first point I mentioned is the impacts, climate change, or even resources. Negative impacts don't affect men and women the same. There's often a difference in how men and women are affected. And also men and women, they have a different wisdom from their relations with the environment, and that's due to their different gender roles. So women have a tremendous knowledge of how, for example, various plants are used for medicine. That's a tremendous wisdom. But they're also impacted. I think Hanan mentioned when there's climate change, and 80% of those displaced from their communities by climate change are women. Um, So often we have to, if we have data about climate change and say coastal or indigenous communities, we have to we say disaggregate it by male and female and see well who's impacted and how. Um, so yeah, so agriculture, an example might be due to climate change, women, their workload increases because many times they farm. This is in the Rupununi, the men hunt. So their workload increases of looking for food, looking for fresh water, tending to the family, etc. Men, on the other hand, they look for other activities such as mining, or they go to Brazil, they look for other work. So the family becomes disintegrated. They spend, men spend long years, months away from home. And the family is left there. When they come back, they want to assert that dominance. So there might be gender-based violence, etc. And I think you just have to ask about climate change in a Rupununi, and they'll tell you the wet seasons are wetter, the dry seasons are drier. You know, it's a reality. It's not something that's theoretical. A social ill of mining is often human trafficking because you have a transient male workforce. They're just going through the area. Um, and they often have no commitments there. And then many young girls and men are trafficked, kept in a cycle of, well, okay, I can't pay you this month, but I'll pay you next month. Or, well, you know, if you come here, this is what you have to do. And just to underscore that organizations like the Guyana Women Miners Association, they often look after, make sure that there's a focus on women who are trafficked. Um, that's their emphasis, but also to ensure, well, okay, women have a say in owning mine sites and have access to, um, training, etc., as men. So those are some ways of including women. Sometimes seemingly harmless activities, like some men, you know, they stun the waters. They say we're fishing, so we use poison, we stun waters for fish. But it affects women who are looking for fresh water or who go to wash. They have to go further distances and often by themselves. Now, so how can we ensure like both women and men have an equitable management of river and resources? I think the first way is by just being aware of the reality, by listening to both genders, by listening to how they're impacted, and by listening to how they use resources and their wisdom concerning these resources. Um, so I found it very interesting. I think just 3% of, say, people who own mines or in Guyana are women. It's a very tiny percentage. And currently, Guyana, when we speak of gender equality, we're 123 of 162, which means we're right near the bottom. Um, so that's to say we have work to do. So if we take into contact access, which who has power in decision making, we have to consider both men and women and to see how that's affected. The final thing I'll leave with us is we have to ask a serious question as a country: is what kind of world we want to leave to our young people. Um, is it a world where there's gender inequality? Is it a world where we've poisoned all our rivers through mining and cut down all our forests? That's a question. What type of world do we want to leave? So thank you for listening, and I invite you, if you have any questions for me or for Hanan or Felicia, to please put them in the questions. So thank you. So Kyle, are you here?
Hello, everyone. I think Kyle's internet has affected him, but we will move swiftly to Felicia's presentation. And as you can see, she's already started. So welcome to tune in. Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Felicia Collins, and today I will be presenting on gender equality and the representation of women in marine conservation. My presentation is entitled Sea of Opportunities. So let's get into it. I want to first start off by defining marine conservation. So marine conservation is the protection of marine species and ecosystem in oceans and seas worldwide. It not only involves the protection and restoration of species, habitats, and population, but it also involves mitigating against human activities such as overfishing, pollution, habitat destruction, and other issues that affect marine life and marine habitats. Now, marine conservation is becoming increasingly important in the face of climate change and also increasing anthropogenic activities. But today, I just want to share a story or my experience rather as a young Guyanese woman studying marine biology and how I got involved in marine conservation. Now, if you are to ask me if I am a beach person or a river person, I would tell you that I'm definitely a river person. Growing up in Region 1, I was exposed to a lot of creeks and rivers, and I wasn't too familiar with the marine environment. Of course, when I came to town, I would visit the seawall, and that was the first time that I interacted with the marine environment. But when we think of the marine environment, we tend to think, blue waters, coral reefs, a lot of colorful fishes, and that is not something that we see here in Guyana in our marine environment. So moving to Trinidad and Tobago to pursue my degree in biology, for me, it was the first time seeing blue waters and coral reefs and all these things that we tend to hear about when we talk about the marine environment. And here I'm going to show you a picture that actually sparked my interest for the study marine biology. Now, if you look here, this just looks like some balls of like little mossy things, but these are actually phytoplanktons, and they live on the surface of the ocean, and they're tiny marine plants that photosynthesize and produce more than 50% of the oxygen that we breathe. And we got this by collecting just a sample of the ocean water and then putting it under a microscope. So you could imagine my surprise when we just threw some water in a slide and put it under a microscope, and there was a whole other um, universe there just thriving with marine life. And for me, this was a kind of eye opener that everything isn't as it seems, and creatures as small as these create the foundation for oceans and life on Earth by extension. So after that, I was so intrigued with the marine environment. I wanted to know more. I wanted to be involved. And I translated that into my everyday life. I joined a few societies at my university, and I got involved in beach cleanups. I attended awareness talks where I could share in my knowledge and what I had learned, and I participated in research, any research opportunity that was available to me. Now, having done all of that and getting that experience, I wanted to do more. I wanted to bring it back home to Guyana. How can I apply what I learned in Trinidad and Tobago to my country, and more specifically, my community? So last year, December, while I was home, I noticed my community had a problem of pollution in our rivers. So if you look to the bottom left, you can see some garbage in the river. And I saw this as a problem. So I thought, why don't we somebody do something about it? And I thought, why don't I do something about it? So I wrote the NDC, which is the local governing body here, and I asked them if it would be possible to donate some garbage bags, some gloves, and the local tractor which collects garbage. And then I reached out to the community and I asked for volunteers to come and to clean up our wharf. And I was so surprised at the turnout. We had, I think we collected more than 200 bags of garbage that morning, and the cleanup even extended further than the aquatic environment. Residents started cleaning around the area. If you look to the bottom left, you see a sign that's very green. And then if you look to the right, you see some very happy volunteers happily cleaning the sign. And for me, that was a moment of, I felt very accomplished, and I felt very inspired to do what I like, and then to get that feedback from residents, and to see that this problem can be solved if we come together as one and we raise awareness for a better community. So even though I am a small fish in the pond, um, and there are increasing numbers of women in science, we are still underrepresented, as we only account for 30% of the world's researchers, and an even lower percentage at higher decision-making levels. Now, if we take that in a local context and we ask, what's the situation in Guyana? Well, if you are a researcher or you do any kinds of studies on Guyana, you would know that the hardest thing to find in Guyana is data. And no surprise, currently there is no data available on the gender gap in science, for any field, not just the marine conservation field, but any field. And Guyana currently has 0% of its area as marine protected area. And this is a problem. Change is definitely needed, but um, why is this change necessary, and how are we going to go about doing these things? So our marine environment, when we think of our marine environment, we tend to think of its direct benefits alone, being fishing and transportation. But beyond that, the oceans and our seas also contribute to climate regulation, because they distribute heat around the earth, regulating our temperatures and our weather patterns. As I mentioned, phytoplanktons produce over 50% of the oxygen that we breathe. The blue carbon ecosystem is something that is becoming increasingly important as we recognize the ability of our wetlands to sequester carbon dioxide at an even faster rates than our tropical rainforests. If you live on the coast, you would know that mangroves protect against flooding and storm surges, and is one that is particularly important because of sea level rise. The ocean also has the potential to generate energy, and, well, a form of renewable energy. Some of the direct benefits that we get from the ocean is food, trade and transportation, tourism and recreation, incomes and jobs, and also there is potential for medicine. Now, incomes and job is particularly important when we talk about marine conservation in Guyana. I think in July 2018, our fisheries sector accounted for approximately 2% of the country's GDP, which is equivalent to 97 million US dollars. And as we also know, approximately 90% of our population lives on the coast. So we can just imagine the amount of persons who depend on the marine environment for their livelihoods. So why is women representation so important in the marine environment and marine conservation? Well, given that women and men interact with marine spaces differently, there is a need to further analyze women's and men's differentiated roles and participation in marine resource use and governance. Women, as Hanan would have alluded to earlier, women are oftentimes sidelined during marine consultations and projects because they're often seen as inferior, or their opinions are deemed somewhat invalid. Um, but to understand the roles that women play in fisheries and marine conservation is important um, if we are going to come up with effective policies to properly manage our ecosystems. So increasing women's rights in marine conservation and hearing their voices could lead to significant impacts on personal and collective levels, which benefit not only the community, but the country as a whole. What needs to be done? Well, we need to support and celebrate the achievement of women scientists with the objective of creating new role models for girls to identify with and follow. And this is one that is particularly important because um, increasing women's increasing women's roles and rights in marine conservation can lead to positive reflections in conservation and also socioeconomic conditions. We need to direct measures to inform, motivate, and support them, which could increase their degree of confidence in co-management and increase their participation, all of which will lead to the all of which will lead to sustainable development as a whole. And when we talk about sustainable development, we just don't mean sustainable development in an environmental sense or specifically to marine conservation, but sustainable development that is also going to lead to better social development and economic development for our country. So thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Felicia. I think she ended off on a really positive note there. And Felicia herself being a very good role model for young girls come behind her who are in the marine environment space and working on for conservation. So now I invite, after listening to what everyone else had to say, what our panelists had to say, speaking on their experience, I would invite all of you, everyone listening. Well, first of all, I would actually, Joel just reminded me, the panelists to put on their cameras so we can have our panelists in front of us. And yes, I was saying, I invite those listening in to share, share your questions, share your thoughts on what you would have just heard. We would prefer to use the chat method, just because if you use your mic, it may get a little bit crowded. So just to help us manage that and make sure we have a really good back and forth, you can type your questions into the chat. And we will happily direct that to our panelists. But to kick it off, I think I can ask a very general question to them so that we can get the ball rolling. And so we talk a lot. We talk a lot about getting to a place of equality, right? Hanan mentioned Equiterra. Joel mentioned something that we were 123rd out of 162 countries. So we're really doing bad on the inequality index. So what do you think? What do you think we can do in real life right here in Guyana to get to Equiterra, and what are some barriers that you see us preventing us from getting there?
Want me to answer? I can give a short answer that if we are to start, we should start with our beliefs, because often it's the what I call pathogenic beliefs about what's women's work and men's work that leads to things being put into policy, etc. And also to make sure that when we do consultations, etc., we specifically ask women what are your needs or how are you impacted, and then ask men separately. Um, that would be my one small contribution that I would say can be made.
I think that we need to look at who has control to and access to resources and who's actually reaping the benefits from them. So this finds itself into lands and livelihoods. And we have laws that kind of reflect cultural perceptions and associations. So we have to find our way of, I guess, like having these conversations with those that can influence policy and make change in government areas, so that all of that kind of links down and gender equality can be mitigated at some point.
I agree with Han and Joelle as well. There are definitely a lot of challenges in marine conservation, but just not only as it relates to gender, but raising awareness in general. Because, I mean, as I had mentioned, our marine environment really can't see anything, and it's hard to get people excited about something that you can't see. So I believe that we need to support not just women scientists, but also men scientists in the field, and help them and help them to inspire the younger generation, whether male or female, to contribute and to know the value of our resources.
Yeah. Before we continue, I just missed just a comment from Joel's presentation. Some S. Hamid said we cannot ignore in this conversation as well that it is the discrimination against indigenous populations, since they predominantly reside in these areas and they are affected by the lack of infrastructure in health, education, security, and job security in these areas. That is then broken down into how each gender is impacted differently as indigenous men and women. So that's a very important point of view coming from S. Hamid there. Just heading over into the chat, here's a question for everyone. Do any of the panelists have an interest in pursuing environmental law in Guyana to better assist with policies, not only in environmental conservation, but to also assist with the gender equality gap? So to the panelists there.
You know, what law can do, I think our policy does this too, is, you know, to specify quotas. But that sometimes just seems like tokenism. If you just put in the law where we have a quota to represent for women, etc. I think what's really important is actually going into communities and listening and hearing directly what's stopping them from participating. Because if you just put quotas are good, but sometimes it's very hard to enforce or to do in practice. But yeah, I have an interest in, if anyone knows about law. I don't know much about that. Yeah.
A lot of our laws in Guyana are archaic. They're very old, and they're also gender biased. So it would be interesting to take up that, but I will focus on community and people engagement.
Right on the bat of Felicia as well, is that environmental law really does, that's not my passion as well. I think that while that is a very important aspect of addressing gender inequality, a lot of it in Guyana is a cultural mindset. So as Joel said, doing it on like a cultural level, in a societal level, that's another area that we have to work a whole lot harder on. And it is a lot harder than just passing a law and saying, yeah, go do this and fill these quotas. And even to fill those quotas, we have to be careful with the ways that we go about doing that, because sometimes you can accidentally like misrepresent it. And like I said earlier, is that you might end up misrepresenting gender to mean women when really it's trying to create a balance between both. But no interest in environmental law.
Yeah, I think just there's a question here that kind of relates to, so they would have asked, you know, what, if any of you have an interest in law. Someone asked, what kind of resources and skill set would we need to help balance the gender scale in Guyana? So again, that question of what kind of skills do we need? What kind of resources do we need?
I'm not entirely sure if it's a question of like skills and resources, because I think to me it's easy. In my head, it's just like just make an effort to include women. And I think we think that it's such a hard job to do because we just haven't been doing it for so long, but it's just to engage on a community level. I think we have a lot of civil societies and other NGOs that are working to bridge this equality gap. And it's not just gender that we have problems with, it's race, it's disability, all those sorts of things. But in Guyana, I think it's just engaging with people, engaging with those societies that have the skills and the capabilities, and just finding ways to implement them and make projects and monitoring and evaluation all align.
But we need to have strong institutions to do that, of course. And I think the skill sets that are needed, people often look down on certain subjects, such as like psychology. If you study psychology, if you study anthropology, you study sociology, we tend to see this as like a low skilled kind of thing. But I think we need to also be more vocal about getting young people involved in those things, raising awareness, like why is it important to study sociology, gender studies, and these things. And I feel like those are the kind of resources, coupled with strong institutions, that we need to reduce the gender gap.
I'm not sure if Joel's going to answer, but I'm going to jump in again with another question that someone asked, which is very, I think it's on everyone's mind right now, the question of oil. So how has the advent of oil drilling in Guyana changed the policies and decisions that need to be made in order to conserve the marine environment? So how does oil change how we conserve the marine environment?
Well, I can just say, of course, that oil contributes to climate change. That's a science. Um, it makes oceans more acidic. It endangers marine life. So that's there, even if we don't spill into the water. But in terms of how it's changed the policies, you often hear more of let's involve women in offshore drilling, etc., and men and women. But what you don't often hear about is how this will affect the actual water, so the marine environment, and the creatures there. And that I think needs to be taken into consideration in policy. So not just employment in the oil sector, but just how would climate change or how would oil spillage affect people that live close to those offshore areas.
I think the oil and gas sector has definitely, like shaken us because currently Guyana does not have any or little to no environmental baseline studies as it relates to the marine environment. And how can you protect something when you don't know what's there? So our oil and gas sector has definitely, well, it should be pushing more stakeholders, the key stakeholders, to get involved in more research and knowing what's out there, and then setting policies, robust policies that will ensure the protection of those marine resources. So I'm hopeful for the future.
Arian Harris said great presentation to everyone. So this is a question to all the panelists here. Is there any interest in building on UG's base for marine biology? And what are some ways we could start?
Yes, definitely. I think, the University of Guyana should be leading the awareness campaign as it relates to our marine environment. And to start, as simple as starting through the biology club at UG, getting those persons who have the theoretical knowledge or the technical knowledge to teach students or community members who are interested or who live close to the coast and the marine environment. Um, One example I could say is maybe going out at the seawalls and doing a survey of the animals that you find there. So you have a bunch of technical experts leading the locals, and you kind of have a transfer of knowledge. So you have you kind of create like parabiologists, I guess. And I think that is something that we can start right through societies. Like students already have the power and they already have the knowledge. So that's something I would like to be a part of.
I think students sometimes feel the need that like the adults are just going to come and change the world or somehow fix things, but we need to recognize the students that we do have the capacity and that power, and that even like with politics and elections, we're always like looking for someone else to do something, but we don't realize the power that we actually do have as students and student bodies, that we can actually get up off our butts and actually make a change. And we are the ones, like Felicia said, we are the ones that have the knowledge. We're the ones that we're the ones that are learning. So I would also love to see a lot of like the University of Guyana doing a lot more awareness projects, and I'd love to be a part of that as well.
I would have missed this question earlier. A question by Daniel Reyes. He said, great presentation to everyone. He wanted to know what are the practical short-term goals that can be taken up in Guyana to conserve the marine environment and to attain gender equality. So, short-term goals. I think everyone is, what they want to know, the realistic baby steps, the real-world actions that we can take to attain gender equality and conserve the marine environment at the same time.
I think the short-term realistic realistic goals. The first one would be raising awareness, getting local NGOs such as the Guyana Marine Conservation Society, the Seawalls and Beyond groups, the University of Guyana, to go out there and to raise awareness in those coastal communities and in Georgetown in general. Also, I think, as Hanan would have mentioned, the stakeholder consultations, how we approach them, we need to align them so that they are more gender responsive. And I think that is something that can be achieved in the short term.
I think that sometimes when we think about the marine environment and the activities that go on in the marine environment, it seems like a very male-dominated space. So I think in trying to look at how the perspectives that we have about the marine environment. So when we think about oil and gas and who that's going to affect, we sometimes need to think about who are the trickle down from that. Like, it's not only the fishermen that are going to be affected. We need to look at the other beneficiaries that benefit from the marine environment. So those who do the post and pre-harvesting of like the fish, when they come in and they collect it and they clean it and they're responsible for selling it in the market. So being able to look at the whole entire sector, not only as male dominated or only considering the activities that men do as the most, I guess, the ones that we financially benefit from the most. And I think that's like one step that we could, so in doing that, being able to look at the marine environment as one that not only men benefit from, but also bringing women into the conversation and having women and men work together, you're generally going to get a better turnout for marine conservation and raising women empowerment.
So this is a comment question from Gabrielle Lute. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. Current efforts in fisheries management to address human and labor rights have failed to adequately protect women's rights and rights of migrant workers, two groups that make up a significant portion of fisheries. In my work in Guyana, we are accounting for women in the sector, but efforts like capacity building are not tailored to be specific for women, their needs and barriers they face in the sector. Do the panelists have any specific thoughts on or interventions to not only engage with women, but to address their barriers to participate and benefit from the marine environment? So do the panelists have any thoughts on interventions to engage with women, not only to engage with women, sorry, but to address their barriers to participate and benefit from the marine environment?
So perhaps the biggest barrier to women engaging, if I dare say, you might say it's men, but apart from men, the beliefs and the structures that sustain that. So while I think it's important to engage women on their own, you have to engage men on their own, and so that we're not having these kinds of conversations in a bubble. You have to challenge their perceptions as how do you view women? They're not supposed to fish, they're only supposed to clean the fish for you, etc. So you have to engage men, engage women too. And then I think someone corrected me that, this is gender equity, not equality, which means it's to each their own. Each has different needs. So you have to specifically zoom in on what are women's needs and then ask what are the barriers. Like, you have to ask that. You just can't assume that. So sometimes in policy, we often assume things, but I don't think you can assume. You have to ask that. Yeah.
I think in fisheries management, well, in Guyana, most of the major fishing communities are often in rural communities, and in rural communities, and they're very deeply rooted in tradition. So it's never an easy conversation to go in and to have, or it's not black and white. Then I mean, we know what we know, and I think it's just something that it's a bit more challenging when we think of it in a rural context, especially as it relates to men and women's role in the fisheries industry. Yeah, it's just hard.
Yeah, I think being context specific with whatever project that we're trying to do, each situation is different. Even though Guyana is big and we kind of know what we know, but each community will definitely have their different things. And getting women to break out of the box that society has sometimes put them in can be dangerous. So I think it's important that when we're trying to get women out of these boxes, we're also aware of the possible repercussions that they might face. And sometimes societies don't like that. So being aware of that when we're trying to get more women involved in things, to be aware of the risk that we might be putting them at as well. It's the 16 days of activism against gender-based violence. So gender-based violence is a possibility of having women probably do things more on their own. So we need to be aware of that and maybe have some sort of structure that ensures their safety and security whenever that's happening.
Thank you. So there's just a general comment from S. Hamid, who said marine spatial planning is the key to effectively and strategically designing conservation policies for the marine environment. We also have a question from Mikhail Amsterdam. This is directed to the women on our panelists here, Felicia and Hanan. As young Guyanese women, do you have any suggestions on improving the public's perception of our marine space and the need to conserve its biological resources?
So improving the public's perception, as I said, it's really hard to get people excited about things that they cannot see. So the first step I would say is raising awareness. And I tend to do this right now. So if I'm involved in any project or I'm participating in any research, I would always take photos and I would post to my social media. And, you know, I would kind of write a little caption explaining what it is. And many times I would get comments and people would say, wow, I didn't know that was out there. I didn't know we had that. So I think using social media as a tool to raise awareness for marine space and marine conservation and our biological resources is one of the most important things we can do. But we need to not only do it on an individual level, but also target social groups. So the Seawalls and Beyond have been doing an amazing job at raising awareness of the resources on our coast there at Georgetown. So I would definitely encourage the UG Biology Society to do the same and to raise awareness.
I think education is a big factor, but it also ties into how you're going to reach the people who can actually make a difference. So I think social media is a great way of getting that information out, but I guess education in general. So I think I was talking about this the other day, how it's funny that we have to try and get Guyanese excited about conserving our marine space or teaching them about it when so much of our culture is deeply rooted in water. We're literally the land of many waters. We go to the seawalls online, we go to the creeks online. I think it's just using those opportunities that we sometimes, those opportunities to Lyme as ways or spaces to also engage in similar ways. So sometimes we have, they paint the seawalls. So I guess that could be one way of putting informative messages or something, but somehow being able to connect that when we go to the seawall, where these mangroves and we see the scarlet ibis flying in and you see the four-eyed fish, that there is value and importance to that. And it's not just there for us to go and like watch the sun, see the sunset, or for watch the tides come by. So education is nice.
On a practical point, I like in the
so
chat.
as we
sorry.
we're just going through some of the comments that some people.
Oh, so I was going to say, Kyle, I was saying I like Casey's point to Gabrielle is that like some of the practical barriers to women's participation is if you hold a meeting at a time when they have to cook for their families or the venue might be too far for them. That's like practically taking consultation into account. Because, you know, it's good to have it theoretically, but, you know, if you have a meeting, I can imagine Thursday afternoon at 3 p.m. and that's the time when the women need to be home. It's not feasible. So I think being familiar with communities is one, and then finding out what's the time that's appropriate for the people you want to listen to is like a very practical suggestion. It might seem tiny, but just something as simple as the timing and the day enables greater participation.
Time, place, and also sometimes women don't feel comfortable speaking in rooms where there are other men, or sometimes issues that they may want to raise in a room full of men, they might not want to do that there. So they're all like little things that we could do to maybe meet with men and women in different groups. But also I think time is important to remember. that women and men's activities throughout the day, they will obviously differ. So obviously not everyone's going to be free at 2 o'clock on a Thursday. Child rearing, child care, women have to have all of those additional care responsibilities tacked onto them. So for like stakeholder consultation, I think that's so important to consider.
So yeah, so as we wind down to the end, I just wanted to highlight some of the comments that are in the chat room. Some by the name of David Singh said great presentation, folks. Dr. Priya Maharaj from UG executed a rapid assessment through the Faculty of Natural Sciences, focusing on understanding the gender balance and disparities in student enrollment at the university, graduation and employment in natural resource and environment sectors. It looked at the role of gender in job choice and their position within the hierarchy of establishments. So you're saying it would be worth getting a hold of this preliminary assessment. So we have quite a few persons who know where we can go to get some of the resources. So thank you very much, David Singh, for pointing that out. S. Hamid mentioned that it's clear that it requires a multifaceted approach involving both private and public institutions, where gender policies are in place to fill the equality gap and solutions to address the issues such as education, capacity building, and sociocultural norms which restrict the liberties of women. And there are a number of chats here. I pray beg that no one else asks any question because we're now winding down to the end. But it's clear that everyone understands that there is a need for yes, there's a need for this talk of how the role that gender plays in marine conservation, in the marine environment, and how we manage the resources. But I'm just going through the last set of questions here, the last set of comments. I want to make sure that everyone, before we leave, everyone is heard. Yes. In addition to David Singh's point, there exists some level of marine research done by alumni and faculty at the University of Guyana. However, the Achilles heel is the drive to publish and make this research available to the general public and NGOs. It comes back to the same point regarding generating excitement and positive perception. I thought that's a really great point, Arian. I think Felicia would have mentioned this. There's not that data. So while there may be some research, it's just that it's not being having it published then is another barrier that we must go through. Yeah. Well, so I cannot go through all of these. It's quite a big amount, but be sure that we can address some of this, some of your comments and some of your questions on the Guyana Marine Conservation Society Facebook page. And of course, this is only yet another installment of the webinar series. There is more to come. There is still more conversation to go. And so I'm really happy that everyone turned out. I'm really happy that everyone was able to engage. And I would be really happy if everyone turned out to yet another installment when we have another installment of the series. So thank you, everyone. Hopefully we will get all of your questions answered on the Facebook page in some form or the other. I think before we close, just to get that excitement going, to let people know that we have engaging conversations and to show Facebook, to show Instagram that we've had engaging conversations. I would invite persons who are on the call, if you so desire, to turn on your cameras. Maybe we can have a photo opportunity just to show the world some of us who are interested in gender and marine environment. So I give that space now over to everyone here. You can turn on your cameras for a brief couple of seconds and we can take a picture for us to share. So put on your smiling faces, your best faces. And it's really wonderful to see that everyone who's here. I saw someone mention that they were joining us all the way from Trinidad. I know persons all across Guyana. Is there anyone else from any other country that might want to hop in a chat box and tell us where they're listening in from? Yes, we have Trinidad. We have Toronto. The UK, wow, we are global right now. Ghana, oh, we have someone from Ghana, Seattle, um, a few persons from the States, New York. Uh, thank you very much to everyone who has joined us tonight. It is a very, very engaging discussion. I know if we had the time, we would go until 10 o'clock, no doubt about it. I think it's a very interesting and engaging topic. But yes, I think if everyone has their camera on, Stella, if you mind capturing everyone here. Say cheese. All right. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you to everyone. And yeah, listen out for the next installment. We'll let you know. Keep tuned. Stay tuned to the Facebook page, the Guyana Marine Conservation Society Facebook page, to be part of our next discussion. And send messages to the page, post, and let people know the discussion that we had here, what things came out of this discussion, and ensure that this conversation doesn't only end here, but it continues in your own spaces. So thank you again. Thank you. Have a good night, and have a good rest of the evening. Bye bye, everyone.